thank you all for joining us, and welcome to this session, which is on supply chain disruption, development and resilience. These conferences, as I'm sure you're very well aware, always aim to deal with the most pressing issues of the minds of those of us that work in public sector roles that connect to contracts, procurement, supplier development, supplier management. And in the last couple of years, we have all noticed significant shifts in the supply chains we work with. We also know that the pre-2020 supply chains are probably not in the shape we will need them to be in for achieving net zero targets in the coming years. This section of our agenda is going to take a bit of a look at how the experience of recent years has been for a procurement manager. That's Christine Lee-Chung that you see on your screens there. We're then going to move on with Jamie Sansom from Scottish Enterprise to one of the national work streams that have emerged out of this disruption and what changes Scottish Enterprise have seen as a result of those shifts. And then a closer look at a project which is emerging in a way that might help us understand what future supply chains could look like. And that's the work Fife Council are doing on H100 with SGN. And Ian Dawson's going to take us through how that looks with the support of Shona Cargill. And it's no accident, and I think this will probably come out through all of the speakers' discussions today, that we talk about green recovery in Scotland, because we have an opportunity to reshape and I suppose resettle our supply chains into perhaps a greener, leaner and maybe shorter shape. And we'll hear from each of the three speakers in turn around those topics for 5 minutes their presentation. And then we'll come back together and consider some of the questions and discuss what we've heard, with our close being at 3:15. So having said all of that, I'm going to hand over to Christine. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Mary. Obviously, I'm going to try and go for 5 minutes, so bear with me, everyone. So good afternoon. As Mary says, I'm Christine Lee-Chung. I've been with Scotland Excel only for a short 6 months, working as a programme manager. Previously to that, I was working at NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, managing the procurement team, and prior to that, I was procurement manager at West Lothian Council. So I've been asked to present today on supply chain disruption, or in other words, a day in the life of a procurement manager. So my presentation is not anything new or any revelations, just my own interpretation of dealing with a supply chain issue. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you back 2 years. As procurement heads, we will all recall how challenging it was at the start of and during the first year of the coronavirus pandemic. The supply chain disruption which we dealt with was extremely challenging. The pandemic affected activities worldwide, among which supply chain disruption was significant. Globally, organisations began shutting down their manufacturing, cancelling orders and suspending production. The impact made us look at our supply chain, of which we had very little control over. Yet we had to ensure we could continue to obtain the goods and services needed to ensure our organisations could keep functioning. At the start of the pandemic, I was working with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. However, the risks and issues which we felt at that time were the same throughout most public sector organisations, as we were all dealing with frontline services. As you'll be aware, the effects of the pandemic started to impact us quickly in Scotland. Our need and demand escalated immediately, and the majority of our supply base was overseas, with supply restrictions put in place by those governments of those countries by restricting exports. I think this is a good example of how we deal with supply chain disruption, as this is the same whether it's during a worldwide pandemic or any other general supply chain issue. Actually, we are still seeing supply chain issues at the moment, with restrictions and record price increases, which we're seeing every day. Next slide, please. So one of the areas which I consider important is understanding our demand and how we can forecast what our needs would be, and ultimately what contingencies we can put in place to ensure ongoing delivery of our services. One of the main risk areas was an increased demand during COVID. We will all recall how difficult it was to predict what our demand would be early on in the pandemic. This was seen in PPE, janitorial supplies, and within the NHS, medical equipment such as respirators. This, coupled with delays in shipments, reduction in production, and the excessive price increases, put a lot of pressure on the procurement community. Next slide, please. So our main challenges, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of products procured were manufactured overseas. And as other countries were facing the same issue with demand as we were, these goods became increasingly difficult to source. Our current supply chain became unable to deliver a sufficient supply of goods received that we had previously evaluated, tried and tested by our services. Guidance for PPE and other medical items would change regularly. As we know, we were starting to understand better about the transmission of the virus. Knowing our demand was difficult. How was COVID going to affect us? How would we know what we were going to need next week, next month, in 2 months' time? The supply market was constantly changing, challenging, and developing. And as we know, we all had the same demand for this limited supply. Next slide, please. However, this issue was just like any other supply chain problem. We just had to react at that time a little bit quicker than what we would normally do. So firstly was to understand our demand. How could we forecast? As I mentioned, this was challenging for us all. Initially, we had little information to allow us to understand what the impact of COVID would have on us. We looked at how these products would be used. From the information supplied by the Scottish National Infection Prevention and Control, we could understand which areas may be affected and what products would be needed. We then had to understand the activities which staff required to perform. This would give us some potential quantity of what was required. However, the big question was how many patients would we be treating and dealing with? Initially, this was difficult to forecast. Within my procurement team, although we had several procurement stores, we were not set up to electronically record our stock in and outwards. However, this was quickly developed by one of our in-house IT experts who set up a system to record and monitor stock via our e-financial system and PCOS. This allowed us to receive weekly reports on our stock levels, how much stock was being delivered to our services and where the biggest users were. The report also advised, based on previous usage, how long our current stocks would last. And once in place for a few weeks, we could start to see the trend on usage and allow us to use this information to forecast our demand. We worked with our colleagues at National Procurement and Scotland Excel to obtain supplies through the National Pandemic Stock, the Four Nations Working Group and framework suppliers. We were all reviewing the market-based current and new suppliers. For example, more suppliers were offering PPE, some existing reputable suppliers and some not so, as I'm sure we all encountered. We looked at different ways of working, new products. As it became even more challenging to obtain the correct and relevant PPE, we piloted the use of full face respirators within NHS GG&C. These had not previously been used by the board. This was a success as it allowed staff who had not previously been able to work on the front line now able to do so, as the equipment suited their needs and protected them. And this also gave us a reusable option, which obviously was a sustainable option to single-use masks. So as I mentioned, throughout this time, we were all constantly engaging with each other, internal stakeholders, colleagues at NHS Procurement and Scotland Excel. We understood that working together and sharing knowledge was now a necessity, as we understood that failure was not an option. We had to succeed. Next slide, please. So the outcomes of dealing with the pandemic and the disruption of the supply chain has allowed us to better understand our demand management processes, put steps in place to ensure that we can deliver and consider our demand versus outputs. We should use this not only to ensure the continuation of the delivery of our recovery plans, but also consider when dealing with our current supply chain issues. This whole process allowed the procurement team to interact with stakeholders daily, and by delivering what they needed when they needed it at such a challenging time has helped build mutual respect and relationships. Procurement were invited to and discussed at every level of meeting within the organisation, including executive management meetings. The organisation could clearly see how important the procurement team are to a successful delivery of their services and objectives. As we continue through the recovery phase and current challenges, we should focus on understanding what procurement can do to support our councils, how we can support areas such as local and economic recovery, and considering which products can be sourced locally. We can move forward working collaboratively, learning from each other, which will enable us to understand and develop our own contingencies, internal processes and supply chain. Thank you for listening, and happy to take any questions if there's time, Mary.
Thanks very much, Christine. If attendees don't mind, I think if we try and combine questions at the end, that would be great. I haven't seen, well, I don't know, I haven't been monitoring the chat actually, so there may be some already in the chat. There are actually. I'll try and pick these up with you later, Christine. So thank you very much for that. That gave us quite a good insight into some of the impact of something unforeseen and the way that impacted on the resilience of our supply chain management more locally. And Jamie's going to come on and speak to us now about, I suppose, some of the ways nationally we're looking at building greater resilience and some of the projects that he's aware of that perhaps have a role in that longer term resilience in Scotland. Thank you.
Oh, you're on mute, Jamie.
There's always one. There's always one. Thank you, Mary. My name is Jamie Sansom and I work for Scottish Enterprise. Scottish Enterprise is one of Scotland's economic development agencies alongside Highlands and Islands Enterprise and South of Scotland Enterprise. I work within a department of Scottish Enterprise called the Scottish Manufacturing Advisory Service, and we are set up. There's 25 practitioners set up to support manufacturing companies across Scotland. Next slide, please, Peter. So manufacturing in Scotland is a really important economic lever. Here are some sort of headline numbers. And I'd just like to highlight the fact that, it employs over 190,000 people and is responsible for more than 50% of international exports and R&D spend in Scotland. So for us in Scottish Enterprise, it's a big lever that we can look to pull on. Next slide, please, Peter. So I'm going to talk to you about three organisations that we've worked with and just explain what their goals were at that time of the work and how they achieved those goals and some of the economic impacts. So this is a company, an organisation that makes vertical farming systems, and the picture up in the top right gives you an idea of what those products are. Essentially, they are towers containing a number of trays in which plants are grown. And on each of those trays, the environmental conditions are closely monitored and governed. So we've got controlled light, temperature, and humidity. Now, this is an organisation that has gone through the initial startup phase, producing a prototype, and is now very much in its scaling phase. So for them, really important to maintain quality and ensure that they have a supply chain that can scale up with them. So the picture down to the bottom left, the flowchart type picture, is how they set up their supply chain. Each of the boxes represents a supplier and a supply item, and the flags within those boxes represent where those suppliers are positioned. And what you'll see is a number of Scottish flags indicating Scottish suppliers. They kept their suppliers close in order to sort of deal with any quality issues and work with those suppliers to overcome any quality issues and ensure that the relationship was tight enough that they could discuss the impact of increasing demand going forward and ensure that those suppliers were able to match that. The output side of things, the impact, if you like, was that 70% of those supply items by value are sourced from Scottish manufacturers. This is an organisation that has a large export opportunity and is satisfying a large export market, and is also creating jobs directly for themselves and also more broadly in the supply chain. Next slide, please, Peter. So we've heard about COVID already, and at the start of the COVID pandemic, there was a requirement to obtain critical PPE supplies. And the main objective was to ensure continuity of supply. And as already mentioned, our PPE, our critical PPE, was all sourced from overseas, and none was manufactured in Scotland at the start of the pandemic. But to ensure that continuity of supply, both the customer and the supply base needed to react in a new way. Commitments by the customer gave the suppliers confidence to invest in new production equipment and allow that manufacturing to begin. So as I'd already mentioned, we had no PPE manufactured in Scotland pre-pandemic. But as the suppliers became more adept at manufacturing the items, we were in a position sort of 6 months after the pandemic, where we were supplying 88% of PPE manufactured in Scotland. That excludes gloves. What that meant was that an extra £100 million was being spent on PPE in Scotland. And this in turn supported additional gross value add and in the region of 1,400 jobs in Scotland. Next slide, please, Peter. So my last example is ScotWind. ScotWind is a leasing round where 17 sites across Scotland have been leased for the development of offshore wind farms. This is to produce in the region of 25 gigawatts of energy. And to put that into context, in June 2020, we had in the region of 10 gigawatts, and that's onshore wind and offshore wind. So we are looking to add a further an additional 25 gigawatts to what we already had. So a huge new market opportunity. Those successful companies who bid for these sites had to pull together a supply chain development statement, which indicated how much local content they could see being consumed as a result of developing their project. But what's very, very clear is this is a new market to Scotland, and companies and suppliers in Scotland will need to adapt and produce new capabilities and greater capacities in order to meet the needs of this market. Next slide, please, Peter. And one more click, please. So I want to give you a little analogy, or not analogy, but an example of drag anchors. Now, these are going to be required to fix the floating turbines in position, and each installation will require between 3 and 5 anchors. Now, we do produce those anchors here in the UK, but generally they're produced in small batches, 1-offs and 2-offs at best. They are to satisfy the oil and gas market. Now, for those of you who may be familiar with the oil and gas market, the prices that will be paid in that market are probably going to be different to those that will be paid for the offshore wind. Currently, they're produced in relatively inefficient factories with low automation. One more click, please, Peter. So what does the factory of the future look like for these to be hopefully supplied from Scotland? The market demands are in excess of hundreds per year. I failed to mention that there will be in the region of 1,200 turbines required, and each of those requiring 3 anchors, let's say. So we're going to need to produce lots of these. So what does the factory look like in the future? One more click, Peter. So what we need to do is we need to give the suppliers the confidence to be able to invest in automation and generating efficient processes. And that might mean a combination of labour and automation. Clearly, with more confidence and more investment, we can produce a higher automated factory. And so potentially it could look like, one more click, Peter, please. Could look something like this, highly automated. But let's just think that, you know, on one hand, we've got low automation on the left side and super automation on the right-hand side. That's the spectrum that we're working in, I guess. One more click, please, Peter. So I'd just like to leave you with some thoughts about how manufacturers are dealing with the challenges that they face just now. These points are taken from a report produced by Make UK as of February this year. So nearly half of manufacturers are increasing those suppliers that are based in Great Britain. So they're bringing their suppliers closer to them. And many companies have also increased the numbers of suppliers that they use so that they're pulling from a larger pool and not reliant on a smaller pool of companies. And lastly, about 70% of manufacturing companies now have strategies in place to work with and manage their supply chain. So that's an increase on what we've seen before. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And those are great examples, I think, for those of us working in this sector, the public sector at the moment. We're seeing significant shifts in availability in areas that you touched on. The impact of much of our farming and our food production being outside of the UK or Scotland is that first example you gave. It helps to think about how those supply chains might shorten in the future and become less dependent on areas. We've seen the price of wheat, for example, the lack of availability Tesco's have had for crisps, I've noticed over the last year or so as well. So there's a number of real life examples that you touched on there, and certainly our reliance on external parties for energy and the price impact that has had. So using the example there of how we'll develop our offshore wind was useful to me too. And you linked well with Christine's PPE discussion too. Thank you very much. So we're going to move on now with Ian presenting and Shona supporting. Well, that's my understanding. You can take a starring role if you like, Shona. I don't mind. But to talk a little bit more about perhaps some of the kind of practical applications of more resilient supply chains, and Ian and Shona are from Fife Council and are working on the H100 project, which I'm guessing some of you will have heard of, with SGN. So this sort of partnership working approach to resolve some of the big issues and challenges we've got coming our way is what they're going to tell you about. Thank you very much, both of you.
Yeah, I'll just share my screen here quickly, and just you picture anytime you fancy showing up. I'm getting off topic or saying something that's slightly incorrect. So
I'll run the timer, Ian.
Good class. Let me know if you can see that.
We can, thank you. Well, I can.
Perfect. Okay, right, we'll just get started then. Fine. Okay, so I'm a business change manager for the Housing Service of Fife Council, and Shona is the lead officer for climate change. So I mainly deal with the domestic side of things, clearly, and Shona deals with everything else, all the kind of council buildings and engagement in the kind of private sector as well. So the real driver for change here, as you can see, there's kind of multiple kind of statutory and legislative things we need to kind of take care of. We're working on our LHEs just now. I'm the business change manager tasked for delivering the new EASH standard and the EASH 2 standard for housing, along with a kind of plan for our remaining non-threat properties. That's balanced against our kind of commitments for new builds, heat and building strategy, net zero for the public buildings that Shona helps support. So you can see there's multiple things on the go that we're all kind of statutorily required to do. They're all the theme, but there are slight contradictions and slight clashes in the priorities of delivering this. You know, we can go entirely for kind of a net zero approach just now, but I've got to balance that against fuel poverty, and that's something that kind of as a regular theme within local authorities and especially in the kind of housing sector. So the transition to net zero, we're on this journey just now. We're kind of making steady progress. So we've done a lot of kind of work with the Fabric First approach in Fife, first of all, for both our properties and through the support from the Scottish Government's ESAFs programmes in the private sector as well. There's a lot more to be done though, but obviously that's the direction of travel we're here to do first, very much Fabric First. The cheapest form of heating you can have at home is the one you don't need to turn on. So that's the kind of where we see the priority just now. But decarbonisation and moving away from kind of natural gas is the future as well. So as long as we're required to kind of achieve EASH 2, which is a kind of massive kind of ramp up in standards. Currently the existing EASH standard means that your EPC rate and your energy performance certificate rating on a house would be somewhere between a kind of a low C and a high D, whereas the aspiration now is you get everything up to level B. So that's a kind of, you're jumping a whole band in some cases for those properties, and that's going to take kind of heavy investment in renewables and more additional extra wall insulation and other areas of work. And you've got to balance that with the pressures that we currently have as a landlord for new build. There's something in the nature of 16,000 people on the waiting list for Fife. So, and every time we have a new build property, there's a ripple effect on that through the entire supply chain, and it means that up to 6 or 7 new households are then appropriately housed, because as everyone kind of moves up that chain. So there's the balance there of the money we spend achieving EASH compared to the money that my head of service has to kind of do new builds. On top of that, we've also got the pressure of no new gas boilers from 2024 on our new build properties. So that's not so much of an issue, given that we're building them to a far higher standard for energy efficiency. If we took, if we got a ban on new gas boilers to our existing stock, that would be a kind of huge challenge financially and also a huge challenge from a fuel poverty point of view. But just now, it's only in our new builds, and obviously we need to kind of over the next couple of years work out what our best option for that is. Is it heat pumps everywhere? Is it infrared, which we've done and tested some properties, high efficiency storage, or potentially hydrogen? And we'll get to hydrogen as well. Then on top of that as well, there's also the kind of role of passive house or other standards that we build to that might mitigate that kind of need for an actual heating source in new build properties anyway. But you always have that kind of balance of being an early adopter, being a local authority on the cutting edge. Building to passive house standards means we're potentially paying a 20 or 30% premium on that unit cost, and you've got to balance that against the demands of another 1,600 houses that are planned for our new build programme. So we're built to that higher standard. We're not hitting 1,600, we might hit 1,200 or 1,300 type thing. So there's always that kind of balance we've got to kind of hit in the middle of. So
got about 3 minutes left, Ian.
Okay, no problem. So the transition to net zero is quite. It's clearly, I've already kind of mentioned the conflicts there before, but you have that EPC East conflict, whereas if we take a heat pump, so if we take a gas boiler out of an existing property now and fit a heat pump, the EPC actually goes down and the person's in more fuel poverty. So that's sort of kind of slightly contrary to what the adverts are saying, what the politicians are saying about we're going green, we're going all electric, we're going heat pumps. Yes, it will help eventually once the grid is significantly decarbonised, but as it stands, it's not the default preferred option just now. Together with that, we've got grid constraints, we've got kind of problems with SSE coping with that demand and that heat. 80% of our heat and hot water, 8% of our domestic energy use is heat and hot water just now, and to take that all off gas and all into electricity, the network's not going to cope with that level of extra demand. So one potential solution is hydrogen. So quickly run through this. We've had quite a bit of experience in the fight for hydrogen over the past 6 or 7 years. We've got a plant down in the kind of Leavenmouth area that has its dedicated turbine, some storage and electrolyser. It currently kind of feeds 2 bin lorries. This is more, Sean has expertise. This is more the kind of side of her, so she can maybe kind of answer any questions that come up directly on that. But we've got a bit of a kind of track record for hydrogen, which helped us be ahead of the kind of pecking order when we've come to being selected as being a partner for SGN for the H100 project. It made sense to build on that little kind of hub we had down there. So as you can see, the plan is to take offshore wind, run it through an electrolyser, store it safely on the site in Methil, and transfer that through a network to 300 homes that are going to be kind of signed up and part of that scheme going forward. And there's also going to be a demonstrator facility built on the site to show kind of the hydrogen compliant boilers, the hydrogen compliant gas cookers or hydrogen compliant cookers and hobs, just to see that it's just the supply of the fuel source that's changing. Your normal everyday interaction with your heating system and your lifestyle and cooking requirements are going to be exactly the same. There's a second phase of this, hopefully, if it all goes well, for the first phase of the 300 properties, and we're through that it works, and we're looking to expand out there. There's potentially kind of huge benefits to hydrogen, obviously being kind of 100% kind of green, and we can develop in the kind of transport hubs. There's a fair bit of industry in that area. There's a huge Diageo distilling and bottling plant and packaging plant that we could potentially feed on the network. There's a new extension of the Leaven rail network coming down there as well. So there's potential growth for Leaven and potentially kind of whole scale expansion of this hydrogen supply going forward. So what does that mean for if we go down this route of kind of hydrogen as being an alternative or part of the future? Well, clearly there's supply chain issues there. We need if we're taking out kind of gas safe boilers that run off kind of natural North Sea gas, and they're changing to hydrogen, we need to retrain the workforce. We currently, as a housing service, do all our 30,000 gas safety checks in house. So there's a huge kind of reskill and retraining issue there. The supply chain, how it works is that your existing gas boiler gets replaced with a gas boiler that is hydrogen compliant. You stay on the gas network until you can be supplied by hydrogen. You then take out the burning chamber within the boiler and put the new one in that's then hydrogen compliant. So everything else stays the same. Your pipework, your matrix, your radiators, your controls all stay the same. There's a single component that changes, but obviously that has to be kind of, if it's going to be a kind of wholesale rollout across the whole country, that there's kind of your Baxes, Worcester, Bosch, Avaliance, they're going to have to kind of change their supply chain and how they kind of manufacture and supply this kit. Same for cookers, same with kind of hobs And also there's going to be a wholesale change in the energy market. Instead of kind of SSC and E.ON selling you gas and electric, they're going to be selling you gas, electric and potentially hydrogen. So quick recount of the challenges here in Fife. It's reskilling that workforce. There's wearing my kind of landlord hat, there's always that balance of what's the kilowatt price for hydrogen going to be. Yes, it's 100% green. It's going to be kind of part of the solution going forward because we can't rely entirely on electricity. But I'm always a little bit cautious about what's the kilowatt price going to be for our tenants, gas to electric. Wholesale production as well. This is SGN are the shipper, so they're proving that their network can kind of carry the supply, and it's a reasonable alternative. Either end of that is you need the kind of the sales side of things for your E.ONs and your SSEs and your OVOs to sell you the hydrogen. And at the other end of that, we've got to have kind of wholesale generation and a supply chain for that hydrogen to kind of cope. And that's the quick flash through of what we're doing in Fife with hydrogen. I'm sure there'll be questions on the back of this, but I'm trying to stick to the 5 minutes. How did I do, Shona?
No bad.
No bad. Oh, I'll settle for a no bad.
Presentation was fab.
Yes, thank you very much to you both. It's a difficult brief to ask you to cover such complex issues in 5 minutes and leave us some time for questions. Any one of those 3 presentations wouldn't have been done justice in the whole 30 minutes, I think. So well done to you all for kind of getting us through so much content in such a short time. We don't, I think, have any particular questions in our our online chat, but and we are actually out of time for our session. Sarah, do you mind if I invite a question or two if people are willing to stay on? Are you happy to?
Absolutely, please go ahead. And if there's any questions, if anybody puts any in the chat as well and we don't get to them, we can always ask our presenters and then put the answers up on the Academy.
Thank you very much. There's Bridget with a question for Ian. To be cost effective, do you need access to your own plant and so be coastal and have offshore wind capability, I think is the question there.
I think that is the plan. It's almost like we're going to go back to the old days of kind of town gas where you make your own supply. So as long as you've kind of access to that water source, and obviously coast will be the logical way of doing it, and you can tap into kind of 100% renewable wind for a wind farm out at sea, then it's likely we'll have plants all around the coast supplying this. Now I think it's something like, correct me here, Shona, I think Hugh, our colleague Hugh's going about 80% the kind of population that lives within like 20 miles of the coast. So that would potentially, so that will potentially kind of be a major solution going forward to this. However, if you have enough sufficient water source inland, it can be power from onshore wind as well.
Okay, thank you. Shona, were you going to come in on that same point?
Yeah, I was just going to come in on that. As Fife Council's got a number of different renewable energy systems that run off a mix of some of the renewable generation we own ourselves and some that we work with partner organisations, such as the Glenrothes Energy Network, where we've worked really closely with the biomass plant there. So we've been able to negotiate with different partners at different rates to make cost-effective decisions there. So it really depends what kind of negotiation you can take forward and how much the partners want to sell their heat.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shona. And there was a thank you there, Ian, from Bridget for your response to that question. And then I've got a couple that are from Colin and from Derek around, I suppose, the kind of the shift, so Derek's question is, do you know why this hasn't taken off as yet? And Colin's is the issue with hydrogen being government buy-in to electric and the kind of the need for tipping that balance almost. Any thoughts on that?
Part of the H100, sorry Ian, I was just going to say part of H100's purpose is to inform the UK government's heat policy, and we're expecting that to be output in 2026. So they're still gathering evidence to inform a hydrogen shift. I think the electrolysing of services is a more known entity, although they obviously recognise that we don't have sufficient grid to electrolise everything yet. So hydrogen's an option that can move and store energy a bit more easily than electricity.
Thank you. A further question from Veronica on, I think, the costs of the capital programme that you're undertaking there in Fife as well. Fife's getting all the questions, Christine and Jamie, sorry about this. but stars of the show, obviously, around the kind of shift in commodity pricing, construction materials pricing, I'm guessing from what Veronica's asking here. How are you coping with that, given I suppose, given the topic of this agenda item, it's a very pertinent question.
Well, SGN signed the checks on this, so that's how we're coping with it. It's as simple as that. You know, they're doing this as a kind of test demonstrator to show that hydrogen can be an alternative fuel source, and the network and their grid can convert over the next sort of 10 to 15 years to supply hydrogen as your fuel of source. So we're a supportive partner of this. We're hoping that kind of a portion of our own stock in the methyl area as part of the Freedom Houses, as part of the pilot, but it's SGN that's kind of underwriting the cost, and that is a significant issue potentially going forward, because I have commented that I think with the changes in the steel costs, the electrolyzer that's currently being built in Norway for this plant is almost going to double in price already, type thing. So it is an expensive exercise, but you know, SGN are a multi-billion-pound company, and if we are moving away from gas, you know, that's the end of their business unless hydrogen will be part of that mix going forward.
Absolutely, and I suppose those supply chain issues and the rising costs may actually influence the output from all of this as well. What will it actually cost to bring this to the 80% of the population that live 20 miles from the coast, if that was something that we wanted to achieve?
I think there's a lot of priorities to be drawn as well. Ian obviously spoke about fuel poverty and the need for tackling homelessness. So it's really focusing on what are the key priorities, but also our procurement colleagues are working really, really hard to get the best prices as well as the best quality and environmental results that they can.
Yeah, Shona and I were at a meeting the Scottish Review Committee that was held at the Platinum Methyl earlier this week, and there's various questions from various MPs and that, but not one of them asked about the kilowatt price for hydrogen. They all looked at the technology and its ability to kind of plug this gap and be the green option, but wasn't on any of the radars that, you know, what's the cost of this going to be for the consumer, what's the fuel poverty impact going to be, which is the point we raised at the end to plant that seed for them.
So there's still some work to come, and I suppose, like anything, and Derek very helpfully referenced us back to emerging technologies of the Betamax. Thanks, Derek. Target audience there. We're all in the right age bracket for that, I think, but not everybody on the call will be. But that sort of some of what is still to come, I suppose, Ian, is around what will it actually cost on the ground? What's the operational kind of how's it going to emerge? How's it going to scale up? I suppose is what remains to be seen, and I think that's probably true for a lot of things Jamie works on, and as well, you know, which of these things will actually take off and be commercially viable. So thank you very much for all of your input, everyone. I'm just going to ignore Stephen Brannigan's heckling from the sidelines and thank everybody, bring the meeting to the close. Thank you for your contribution today. It's been great. Really liked the kind of flow of the kind of problems, some of the emerging solutions and some of the practical things that you're trying out at Fife. And I think we could have, as I said, we could have spent the whole 30 minutes on any one of the three and perhaps longer. So thank you very much for compressing so much information into such a short time. And I look forward to working with all of you and everybody on the call in how we develop our supply chains in the public sector going forward. Thank you very much. Been a great session.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, guys. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.